Thank you, Cass. Thank all y'all for coming today. I have some illustrations to go with my talk, if I can get them to pull up here. My talk today is based on my first book. This actually was my doctoral dissertation, Lee's Tigers, the Louisiana Infantry, and the Army of Northern Virginia. This was published back in 1987 by LSU Press, and of all the things I've done, this is what I'm probably most known for today. It's a history of the Louisiana Confederate soldiers that went to Virginia during the Civil War and fought for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And it became nicknamed the Louisiana Tigers, partly because of their fierceness on the battlefield, but more so because they had a reputation for being drunks and thieves and cutthroats and bad characters in general. And I'm proud to say that this book is still in print 24 years later. But when I started the dissertation, I knew all the stories about the Tigers, and I really went into this project expecting I would find that the Louisiana soldiers were not nearly as bad as has been said, that all these tales were exaggerations. But what I found out was they were even worse than we thought they were. They gained a reputation for just rowdishness, and I tell my students of Louisiana history, Louisiana has always had a reputation of being populated by seedy characters, and it's not true. So I'll preface this whole presentation by saying that most Louisiana soldiers in the Civil War were good, decent, honest, God-fearing men, but there's no doubt that there was a large criminal element mixed in that kind of tainted the reputation of everybody. And kind of what accounts for all this is Louisiana has always been a unique state, but it was particularly unique back in 1861 for a number of reasons. One was Louisiana was the only southern state that was predominantly Catholic. And this was a time when the tension between the Catholic Church and Protestant Church was much more severe than it is today. So that made Louisiana soldiers kind of stand out. Also, Louisiana was the only southern state that had a large population of newly arrived immigrants. And when we think of immigration, we automatically think of Ellis Island and New York City, and we kind of forget that New Orleans was the second largest port in the United States. And in the 1840s and 1850s, tens of thousands, mostly Irish, but also Italians and Germans and Swiss and Greeks, poured into the state through the port of New Orleans. And in fact, when the Civil War began, nearly half the population of New Orleans was born outside the United States. And these poor immigrants were forced to take whatever jobs they could, and most menial labor. Many of them worked on the rough and tumble wharves of New Orleans, the steamboats. Thousands of Irish built many of the levees that you see around the state today. They're often referred to as slave levees, but they're really Irish levees. And living in this kind of environment, thievery, fighting, drinking, was sort of seen as necessary to just survive. And when the war broke out, apparently thousands of these immigrants joined the Confederate Army, not really out of patriotism for the rebel cause, but just to survive. It was a way to get a square meal. And one thing you see over and over is all the tales of looting and drunkenness and mayhem. They're nearly always associated with regiments that were raised in New Orleans, and they have a high number of immigrants in them. Another thing that made Louisiana soldiers stand out is some Louisiana units adopted what's called the Zouave uniform. This is a painting of two Louisiana Zouaves. This is patterned after the French Algerian Zouaves, who were seen as sort of elite troops, and they were just popular during the Civil War era, kind of like the French Foreign Legion became popular in the 1920s and 30s, thanks to Hollywood. It's amazing that how popular also Louisiana Tigers are with modern day artists. If you collect Civil War prints, you see them all the time. But this is a typical Louisiana Zouave uniform. They have these red fezzes with a tassel down behind. Usually there's a slogan across the fez, something like "Death to Lincoln." They have these blue coats, sometimes they're brown with red trimming, bright colored shirt, Bowie knife, baggy striped pants, white gaiters. They're armed with a huge 58 caliber musket. And I always tell people, close your eyes and imagine a heavily armed Shriner. And you kind of get wild. And some of these units, something else that made Louisiana stand out is when they do get to Virginia, there were some entire Louisiana regiments where nobody spoke English. The Cajun French and the Creoles, even their drills were given in French. They used French bugle calls. And they later have to abandon all that and be incorporated into the Army, and they have to relearn everything again in English. But there are several regiments and units that kind of stand out that gets this reputation for Louisiana soldiers. One of them was a battalion commanded by this man here, Major Gaston Coppens of New Orleans, his brother standing beside him. Coppens was a highly educated French Creole. He attended several military academies in France. And he was given permission to raise a battalion of Zouaves, about 500 men. And he, as one person said, something else about the Louisiana troops, one Virginian said they had, quote, the good taste to bring women with them. And in some of these Louisiana units, and Coppens Zouave is one of them, you have female soldiers called vivandières, and this is a French custom. These are not camp followers. There were lots of camp followers during the war, but vivandières, they're sometimes nicknamed daughters of the regiment, and these are official members of the unit. They're carried on the rosters, and they nurse, they cook, they do whatever. This is a rare photograph. This is Coppens' battalion here, and the vivandière, she has, looks like an ostrich plume hat, her own uniform, she has a sword here, looks like she's wearing almost a kilt, and she's taking a piece of paper or something from this man. But you find vivandières in a lot of Louisiana regiments. Sometimes they even went into battle with the men. The Coppens' battalion was sent to Pensacola, Florida, and that's where this photograph was taken. If this was a colored photograph, you would see lots of reds and blues in uniform. They have these wide sashes around them. This is the vivandière over here. My wife Carol and I just got back from Pensacola where I gave a talk, and they told us that these buildings in the background are still there. They've survived the hurricane somewhere in town. But Coppens' battalion is the first Louisiana unit that made the headlines. They were shipped from Pensacola to Virginia by train. And all these officers, they are high-ranking, well-to-do, educated Creoles. The men said came from the dregs of society. There were stories that Coppens recruited straight from the jails of New Orleans, which may or may not be true. But they put the men on the train, and the officers didn't want to associate with the low class. So they had a special caboose they put on the back of the train, and when they were in Alabama, they stopped to take on fuel and water. And the officers decided to go into a restaurant there at the station to get breakfast. And right when they sat down, they heard the train start up. They looked out, and the Zouaves had uncoupled the officer's car and stole the train. And it took the officers about an hour or so to round up another locomotive to give chase. But the Zouaves went on up to Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederacy, and promptly began to loot the town. They broke into stores, they were robbing people in the streets for an hour or so, and the mayor of Montgomery was rounding up some militia to try to corral them. And one witness said about that time the locomotive arrives with the officers, and he said it looked like the charge of the Light Brigade. He said the officers jumped off the locomotive with their pistols drawn and went down the streets, ordering the men back on the train, and anybody who hesitated got pistol whipped. And one young lieutenant eyed a guy coming out of the store with an armload of shoes, and ordered him back on the train, and he hesitated for a moment, so the officer just cold-cocked him with the pistols, knocked him unconscious, and had him drag him back on board. So they finally restored order, but the conductor of this train, who rode with him to Virginia, said it was like that every day, that he noticed that some of these wives were riding on top of the cars, and others were on the coupling between the cars, and he tried to warn them how dangerous that was. He said they just cussed him out and laughed about it. And the records show that 2 men were killed when the train went under a tunnel, just swept them off. One was killed when the train lurched and crushed him on the couplings. And the record also says that one officer shot and killed one of the men, and it doesn't say why. So all this made headlines, and when they marched through Petersburg, Virginia, there's a letter I found from one resident, and he said they were the most savage-looking crowd that he had ever seen. And he said that they were from every nation on earth. And the records I went through in the Tulane Library, I was able to document 24 different nationalities show up on Louisiana rosters during the Civil War. So Copland's battalion was the first one that begins to get an inkling of what Louisiana soldiers were capable of. And then almost immediately afterwards, this man made the news, Valery Sulikowski. He was a Polish individual, military trained in Europe. He was involved in the revolution of Europe in the 1840s and fled to the United States afterwards. And he was given permission to raise a Polish regiment, but they found out there weren't enough Poles in Louisiana to man a regiment, so he let anybody join. But he formed a unit called the 14th Louisiana, sometimes it's called the Polish Brigade, and largely from New Orleans, a lot of immigrants in it. And the men said that Sulikowski was just merciless, that one soldier said that he was the incarnation of military law, despotic, cruel, and absolutely merciless. After I wrote the book, I found a memoir where a soldier said that Sulikowski was drilling the unit one day, and his horse began to buck and rear. He was having a hard time managing the horse, and it got to embarrassing him in front of the men. So he finally just dismounted, took his sword, and stabbed the horse to death on the parade ground, and the men just had to kind of drill around the dead horse. His men engaged in a riot in Grand Junction, Tennessee, another train ride, and Sulikowski suspected that once they made their stop at Grand Junction to take on fuel and water, the men would want to go to the bars. So he ordered the men to stay on the train, and he placed guards around all the taverns in town. What Sulikowski didn't know was they were already drunk. They had smuggled 2 barrels of whiskey on the train, and they simply disobeyed the orders, got off, and began to break into stores. And something happened. The record's not real clear, but some kind of a scuffle broke out between one of the guards and one of the drunken men, and a riot erupted. And you had hundreds of the soldiers started attacking the officers, and they chased the officers into a hotel that had several hundred people in it. And the officers barricaded the door, but the men just set fire to the hotel and tried to burn it down. And this went on for some time, until finally one officer pulled a pistol out and just shot one of the men dead. And they began to do that. And Sulikowski, they said, arrived on the scene furious, with his pistol drawn. And he would order a man back on the train, and if they hesitated, he just killed him in the street. And one tragedy that took place was he walked up to a sergeant and ordered him to the train, and the sergeant refused or didn't do it. And Sulikowski didn't know it, but this sergeant was one of the good guys. He was a loyal non-com trying to help the officers gain control. But he assumed that he was a rioter, so he shot him dead. And unfortunately, the sergeant's wife was there, watched it. She had come to meet him at Grand Junction to see him one last time. And when Sulikowski finally realized he'd killed a loyal man, they said that he took care of the widow financially for the rest of her life to try to make amends for it. There was a newspaper reporter there, and he said by the time they quelled the riot, the officers had killed 7 men, shot 19 others. And this reporter said, the hotel looks like a hospital after a hard battle. The dead and wounded are strewn all over the second floor. So by the time the Louisianians get to Richmond, Virginia, they've already made the headlines. This is the battle flag, or the national flag, of the 6th Louisiana, which was a predominantly Irish regiment, and their motto was, "Let us alone, trust in God." But it was the Zouaves, Coppin's men, that began to terrorize Richmond. You found a lot of quotes from Richmond citizens. One said the city was thrown into a paroxysm of excitement when the Zouaves arrived. Another one said they're composed of wharf rats of New Orleans and look wilder and are usually drunker than any Indians. They are the lions of town now. Another resident wrote, from the time of their appearance in Richmond, robberies became frequent. Whenever a Zouave was seen, something was sure to be missed. The authorities tried to pin them up, and they put them on the second floor of a tobacco warehouse and put guards around the building. But the men just took these sashes off, made ropes, and climbed out the warehouse, went to town. One Richmond citizen said they roamed about the city like a pack of untamed wildcats. Thieving, burglary, and garroting in the night was common as long as the Zouaves were in town. A Confederate soldier said that the pirates are from the dregs of all nations. The 10 days they were here, they killed 18 or 20 head of cattle. One of their favorite tricks was to walk into a Richmond bar, drink all they could, then they tell the barkeep just to charge it to the government. And they'd walk out and go find another bar. Another unit, the 10th Louisiana, which had some Zouave men in it, they were sent out to the Williamsburg, Jamestown area. And one of their generals was in the midst of writing his wife a letter when the two commanding officers walked in, and afterwards he wrote, he said, I don't think they can speak English at all. And this general sent them out to Jamestown Island. And later the general said that the Louisianians stayed on Jamestown for 18 hours. And he said, they eat up every living thing on the island except 2 horses and their own species. But despite their criminality, people were fascinated by them. And it became popular in Virginia for people to pack a picnic lunch and go out to the Louisiana camps and watch them drill, because they do it in French. And some people came to like them. One Louisiana unit stationed at Williamsburg threw a Mardi Gras parade for the people that they've never seen before. They enjoyed that. But of all the units, the one where the name comes from, Louisiana Tiger, involves this man. This is Roberdeau Wheat. He was a Virginia native who settled in New Orleans. Huge man, 6'4", about 250 pounds. He fought in the Mexican War. He was in William Walker's filibustering expedition to Nicaragua, and he was fighting in Italy with Garibaldi when the war began. So Wheat came back to Louisiana and raised his battalion, called Wheat's Battalion. And one of his companies was a Zouave company called the Tiger Rifles. They always adopt colorful names. This is a painting. It's called Tigers to the Rescue, of the Tiger Rifles attacking a Union artillery battery. But Wheat's men became very famous at the First Battle of Bull Run, and he was, they said, the northern newspaper said that at Bull Run, the Louisianians ran out of ammunition and pulled out their Bowie knives. And the New York Times said that they had their Bowie knives had a string about 10 feet long on it. And that was so that they could throw the knife into a Yankee soldier and pull it back to them. Not have to go up there and get it, but just drag it back and throw it at somebody else. But Major Wheat was badly wounded at First Bull Run. He was shot with a .58 caliber bullet under one armpit, went through both lungs, came out the other armpit, and amazingly survived. Took him about nearly a year. But when he was wounded, he was the only man who could command or control these men, because he would shoot them as well. So when Wheat was wounded, the Army appointed a Virginia officer to try to take command. He lasted, I think, 3 days and quit. So they finally got another Louisianian, a man named Colonel Charles de Choiseul, who was from New Orleans, a French Creole. And the Choiseul wrote a number of letters home, about half were in French, half were in English. But he told what happened right after he took command of these men. He wrote a friend, he said, I have become a tiger. I am a victim of circumstances, not of my own will. Whether the tigers will devour me or whether I will succeed in taming them remains to be seen. And he told the story, he said that in one day, one of the men walked up to the orderly by the colonel's tent and tried to kill him, pulled the musket's trigger 3 times, the gun just misfired, don't know why. So they put him in the guardhouse. He said later in the day, somebody beat up and robbed their washerwoman in a thicket in camp. Didn't find out who that was. The colonel went to bed that night, and he said about 10 o'clock he woke up to a noise down at the guardhouse. And he went down there, and several of the Tiger rifles were trying to break out some of the men that had been arrested early in the day. And so they had a big free-for-all, and Colonel Choiseul said that he had to pistol whip several men, and said finally I had 7 or 8 men bucked and gagged. And this is bucking and gagging. It's a common Civil War discipline where you run a stick behind a man's knees and tie his arms around that and put a stick in his mouth and leave them like that for hours at a time, but very painful. And then de Choiseul said, kind of an understatement, he said the men were in kind of a surly mood the next day. And he noticed some men were walking out of camp without permission. So he rode over to them, and they said that they had permission from the sergeant. And the situation starts to escalate. The Choiseul was placing men under arrest. He knocked one guy down a couple of times for, he said, being impudent at him. And the colonel was on his horse. And he said in this letter that pretty soon the Tiger rifles had surrounded him and very menacing. And he said, I put my hand on my pistol and I warned I'll shoot the first man who raises a hand. And he said no sooner he said it, that this big double-fisted man, he described him, said walked up to him and cussed the colonel out and said, well, shoot me. And he did. He pulled his pistol out and shot the guy right in the face. And he said the bullet knocked out his upper teeth, went through his tongue, knocked out his lower teeth, and came out. And matter-of-factly, de Choiseul said that quelled the riot. That the men quickly retreated. And according to the colonel, they loved him after that. All he had to do was shoot one of them, like Wheat would have done. And when Wheat finally did come back, de Choiseul was riding back to his own unit. And he said he met one of the Tiger rifles in the road, and so the man just started crying and was kissing his hand and just how sorry he was to see him go. And then the colonel added, said he was drunk at the time. So the Wheat's battalion, because of this one unit, these Zouaves, Wheat's battalion becomes known as the Tiger Battalion. And then when other Louisiana units, like the 14th and Copham's Zouaves and the 10th Louisiana, show the same kind of behavior, within a few months, all Louisiana soldiers in Virginia were just nicknamed the Louisiana Tigers. And it sticks with them from then on. And they were so infamous for this kind of behavior that anybody who was caught stealing just identified themselves as a tiger to throw the authorities off. One soldier said all the devilment that was done, the Louisiana troops had to bear. A Tennessee soldier said that noisy, rascally, slandered set the Tigers. Such was the reputation that anyone caught stealing claimed at once to belong to the Tigers. All the mischief was laid to them, and they had a good right to much of it. One of the Catholic priests who serves as a chaplain for one of the units, he wrote home and said, the Louisiana soldiers have gained such reputation for pilfering and general laudishness that as soon as anyone sees them coming, they bolt the doors and windows. Usually any affiliation at all with the Louisiana boys is enough to assure one a cold welcome no matter where he shows his face. Stories of their actions are legion. After I wrote the book, I ran across another memoir where a soldier said that they had captured several barrels of whiskey. And the officers took what they could for the medical department, and they dumped the rest of it in the ditch to keep the men out of it. And this soldier said the Louisiana Tigers were about 100 yards down the road on their all fours, lapping up like dogs when the whiskey hill ran through the ditch. People were scared to death of them. And during the Gettysburg campaign, one woman had a Confederate soldier walk into her house and very politely asked her, could he have some food? And she made the mistake of asking where he was from, and he said Louisiana, and she fainted right on the floor, expecting the worst. The first executions in the Virginia Army were 2 Louisiana Tigers. In fact, it was the 2 of the men that tried to break the soldiers out of the guardhouse that Deschoisse will talk about. They made the whole division watch, and the 2 men sat on the coffins. The firing squad was 12 men picked from their own unit. And they weren't sure, the authorities weren't sure when the order was given, would the firing squad actually shoot the men? So secretly they put a second firing squad behind the first firing squad. And the order was that the Tiger rifles do not execute their comrades. The executioners will be executed. But they did. And the graves of these 2 men were found about 30 years ago near Centerville, Virginia, and that's how we know exactly what the Zouave uniform looked like. The bits of uniform were still in the grave. So if that was the end of the story, you would think that maybe the South had been better off without the Tigers. But the reason the Army put up with their antics was that they became known as some of the best fighters in the Army. And they played a major role in some of the biggest battles in Virginia. First Bull Run, Weeks Battalion, was the first to make contact with the Union, and there were only a few hundred of these men. And for a couple of hours, Weeks' men, more or less by themselves, held back about 12,000 Union soldiers until General Beauregard, the Confederate commander, could organize a better defense. And this is where Wheat was badly wounded. Stonewall Jackson gave the Louisiana Tigers credit for his victories in the Shenandoah Valley. This is Stonewall Jackson on a horse here. Jackson defeated 3 different Union armies in the Shenandoah. He was outnumbered 4-1, and there were 3 major battles, and the Tigers played the key role in each battle. This is the last one, a place called Port Republic. And Jackson ordered the Louisianians to attack these Union cannons. And it took them 3 tries, but they finally captured it, and that won the battle. And Jackson was so excited, he rode up to congratulate them, and Jackson gave the Tigers the cannons they'd captured to use. One of the most famous exploits was at Second Bull Run. Stonewall Jackson ordered his most dependable unit to hold a weak spot in his line. So they put the Tigers there, and the Union Army attacked all day long, about a dozen different attacks. And finally, the Louisianians ran out of ammunition. But Jackson had told them that they cannot retreat. If they retreat, they lose the battle. So, not being able to retreat, not having any more ammunition, they picked up rocks and started throwing rocks at the Yankees. And if you go to Manassas today, if you walk down where the front line was, when you get to this particular spot on the battlefield, there's a big mural, pretty much the same scene. They became known as the diehards, but they held the line with rocks. And then at Antietam, which was the bloodiest single day in American history, the Tigers were in the thick of the fighting. This is an artist depiction of what happened there. They were fighting in a cornfield over here, and the Tigers got pushed back to this rail fence. And they took up a position behind it. The Union Army took up a position on the other rail fence over in here. So they're separated by about 20 feet. And they stood there for like an hour just shooting each other. This is the artist's depiction of it. This is an actual photograph that was taken a couple of days later by one of Matthew Brady's associates. This is probably one of the most famous photographs of the Civil War, and it's always used to show the carnage of the battles. And a number of years ago, a historian was able to firmly identify that these are Louisiana dead. They were fighting another famous unit called the Iron Brigade across the fence. But this is just some of the 126 tigers who were killed in one day at Antietam. One of the other famous exploits was at Gettysburg. The Louisianians were the only Confederate unit to actually break the Union lines at Gettysburg. If you've been to the battlefield, this cemetery gate is still there, kind of the heart of the park. But the Louisianians launched an attack right at dark and managed to overrun and capture these Union artillery pieces, and finally had broken through the enemy position, but nobody came up to support them. And there were so few of them left alive that when the Union Army counterattacked, they drove them back out and back down the hill. By the time the war ended at Appomattox, when Lee surrendered Appomattox, best I can tell, there were about 12,000 Louisiana Tigers in Virginia. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox after 4 years, of the 12,000, there were 373 left. About 1 in 4 died, about 10% deserted, thousands were in prison camps, thousands were wounded and sent home, but kind of give you an idea of the attrition rate. With their name, and this is one illustration. This is a Louisiana tiger. Not exactly what you think of a drunk and a cutthroat. Actually, this is a Ouachita Parish boy. A lot of Ouachita Parish men, North Louisiana men were among them. His name was Edmund Jemison, and he joined the Army when he was 16 years old. One of the local units was called the Pelican Grays. This photograph was probably taken right before he left to go to Virginia, age 16. Next year, when he was 17 years old, he was going into battle and was decapitated by a cannonball. So he is one of the thousands of Louisiana dead left behind in Virginia. But their name still lives on. Nicholls State University in Thibodaux is named for a Louisiana tiger. This man, Francis T. Nicholls. Nicholls was a popular officer, but his men worried about him because he tended to get a body part shot off in every battle he was in. You notice his left arm is missing. One of his very first battles, he had his left arm shot off. It took him about a year to recover. They made him a general. Came back. His next battle, he wrote about it. He said that a cannonball tore through his horse's stomach and blew Nicholls' left foot off when it came out the other side. Recovered from that, still served for the rest of the war, and came back to Louisiana and was elected governor twice in the late 1800s. And his campaign had two slogans they used. One was Nicholls would ask the voters to please vote for all that's left of General Nicholls. And the other one was he'd ask, please vote for me for governor because I'm too one side of the judge. And of course, then there's LSU. Contrary to popular belief, LSU's mascot is not a Bengal tiger, it's the Louisiana Tigers. And back around 1900, Dr. Charles Coates was trying to pick a mascot name for LSU. And a lot of the Tiger veterans came to LSU as professors. David Boyd, the most famous one, became president. Boyd Hall's named for him. But some of the veterans told Dr. Coates that there never was a tougher set of men alive than the Louisiana Tigers. And so he chose that as the mascot name. And if you look at old newspaper reports, the LSU sports teams were always referred to as the Louisiana Tigers until the mid-20th century. It wasn't about the 1940s, 1950s, you start seeing LSU Tigers or the Fighting Tigers, but it's the Civil War soldiers is a mascot, not it's just kind of morphed over the years. Finally, today's Louisiana National Guard, the 256th Brigade, traces its ancestry back to the Louisiana Tigers. These are the modern day Tigers. And back in 2002, the Louisiana National Guard was federalized to go to Iraq. And they were sent to Fort Hood, Texas, and were brigaded together with the 69th New York National Guard, which also traces its ancestry back to the Irish Brigade in the Civil War. The last time the Louisiana Tigers and the Irish Brigade met was in hand-to-hand combat on Malvern Hill, Virginia. These were Tigers. They were ordered to attack up this hill, and they were one of the few Confederate units that made it all the way up to the Union position, and there was an intense hand-to-hand fight, and the Tigers were finally driven away. But when it was over, one of the officers for the Irish Brigade here requested new muskets for his men, and he said that they had bent them up in a, as he called it, a scrimmage with the Louisiana Tigers, and his commanding general thought they just lost them and refused to do it till he was taken out and shown a pile of muskets, and he said that the barrels were bent, the stocks were splintered, that they really had quite a go. So kind of comes full circle. The Louisiana Tigers and the Irish Brigade, the 69th New York, fought hand-to-hand in the Civil War, and then in 2002 they were sent to Iraq together. And on January the 2nd, 2005, 6 of the modern Tigers, the National Guard, and 1 of the modern Irish Brigade were all killed together in an IED explosion in a Humvee. And that's where I always end my presentation. That's, I think, a kind of a completion of the journey, that we've come full circle, and we used to fight hand-to-hand 150 years ago, and now they're fighting and dying together in Iraq. So that'll be more than you want to know about the Louisiana Tigers. And if you had ancestors in the Tigers, I'm talking about all the other guys. I'm sure your great-great-grandfathers were good people. All right, so anybody have any questions? Or?